Dundee Younger, you're the lead of rare earth team at Benchmark Mineral Intelligence. Rare earths has... How long have you been actually looking at the rare earth market at Benchmark? It hasn't been too long now, has it? This is a relatively new space.
It's a new space for us at Benchmark, yeah. So we've launched, we really started work on it in January, launched our first report in around May. I'm now getting ready for our Q3 report.
Awesome. Okay, well, kick things off. How are you finding the rare earth space in comparison to any other metals that you've looked at? What makes rare earths rare and unique and interesting to you guys?
What makes them interesting, I think, is the fact that they're so China dominated, but that there is this great potential for really quite significant supply side plurality. So you see massive growth potential growth in supply in the US, in Australia, really interesting developments in end-of-life recycling in Europe, and of course their end use in e-mobility and wind turbines and consumer electronics, not to mention defense applications like F-35s and fighter jets and missile systems, all combined to make this an incredibly interesting market. It's very exciting, a lot of new things to learn, and I think it's developing every quarter. So that gives us the honor of growing our knowledge with the market.
Good. You said China dominated there.
Yeah.
Do you mean that from a supply perspective, from a demand perspective, both? What do you mean?
A little bit of both.
Yeah.
A little bit of both, but mainly supply side.
Okay. So tell me a bit about the supply side of this market. Obviously, like you said, like most metals in today's world, China dominated. How much so with rare earths?
So it depends on which rare earth we're talking about.
But let's go for NdPr, for example,
Yeah.
the most common used in magnets and EVs.
Yeah, exactly. So for NdPr, China accounts for the majority of mining in this year. They will also account for more than 90% of processing in this year. So that's if you go from mining to processing towards oxide. But then if we look past that to look at metal making and magnet making, and even past magnet making into motor making, China stays at this sort of 90% dominance. When we look at something like dysprosium, which is also a rare earth that's very important in magnets that are used at high temperatures, because it allows them to maintain their magnetism even at temperatures of like 180 degrees Celsius. Mm-hmm. Otherwise, they just permanently demagnetize.
Yeah.
So dysprosium is crucial for magnets in e-mobility, wind turbines, and the like. That's where we see Myanmar mining up. This year, we're expecting about 40%, China to make up most of the rest. Of course, there are alternative sources of supply, but it's really Myanmar and China dominated. And all of that goes directly into China, such that we're expecting China to process around 99% of dysprosium oxide this year.
Wow. Okay.
Yeah. So it's extremely dominated by China.
Taking a step back, I probably should have started with this, but tell me about the pricing at the moment for NdPr, because it has pulled back a bit in recent times, hasn't it?
Yes, it has. So I guess it makes sense here to start with what prices have been like over the last year, and then we can take a wider perspective. So over the last year, I think pure Nd oxide was at about $100 per kilo.
Yep.
It's just dropped fairly continuously, fairly stable downward trend towards about $65 a kilo, $67 a kilo, and that's where it's oscillated ever since about May or even April. Right. So it's stayed at about $65 a kilo. And what's interesting is that it's been extremely stable. So usually over the last 3 years, pure Nd oxide prices have had much higher baseline volatility, particularly when we're looking at something like noise volatility or just standard deviation. It's been a lot more volatile than before. So it was a real break in the market. Now what we've seen over the last 2 quarters is that prices have been extremely stable. And even standard volatility that you'd expect, or standard, say, seasonality in the PRND price series hasn't really been there to the same degree as usual. And what we think has caused that has been very purposeful intervention by the Ministry of Industry and Information Technology in China.
Okay, so suppressing prices, or not suppressing, I guess, but I guess regulating prices to an extent, controlling the amount of supply that's coming online.
Exactly, yeah. So that ministry sets production quotas every half year. So they tell the rare earth industry in China how much they're allowed to mine in any given, how much they're allowed to mine and how much of that domestically mined material they're allowed to process in any given half year.
Okay.
And I wouldn't necessarily call it price suppression, or you can call it what you want. For them, it's a return towards rational prices. Because if you take a full supply chain view, China, like I said, not only dominates rare earth mining, processing, magnet making, motor making, but they also have a massively growing EV industry where they're beginning to export more and more electric vehicles. So it is in their interest from a wider economic perspective to make sure that input prices of raw materials that they can control are stable and are rational.
Agreed, but I think looking outwards, inwards into China, you can see why I guess people might think it is suppression of the price, because their costs are a lot lower than Western costs, and I guess one of the things I'm trying to get my head around is $65 per kilo. Is that incentive enough for Western companies to actually make money and to, a lot of these companies, you look at a lot of the big projects that need to be built outside of China, you're talking about huge capex here, 2-3 billion.
Yeah.
Is that an incentive price to actually go and raise that capital and build these projects?
Our analysis suggests current prices are below incentive levels.
Okay.
So most projects will likely need around, can give a wide range of about $75 a kilo at its lowest to probably about $110 a kilo. Yeah. So at the moment prices are low, too low.
And what's China's ability to keep them as low as they are? So say even looking more further forward, I guess one of the main issues that we might have is if they've got a pretty large reserve life in China in terms of the mining, they've got the largest processing capacity as it is already. What's their ability to keep ramping that up and adjusting it based on supply and demand?
I think the capability is there, to put it plainly. So we know that the largest mine in China is in Inner Mongolia. It's a mine called Bayan Obo. And even if it keeps growing at the rate it has been, which has been massive, I think their half-year output for this half year, so H1 of 2023, is about the same as their total year output in 2018. So they've grown massively. We think they can continue to keep growing and still have a mine life of more than 200 years. It's a similar picture for mines in Sichuan that are sort of the second biggest hard rock mines in China. I think the bigger challenge is when it comes to ionic clays that are heavy rare earth rich. That's where Myanmar has been sort of accounting for China's lack of growth in the mining of those elements. But also when we're looking at processing capacity, we know very clearly, very recently, China Northern Rare Earth Group, the ones who operate Bayan Obo and who have many companies that are able to process and separate rare earths all within Baotou. We know that their capacity was last year at around or just above 120,000 tons of rare earth oxide. They've recently stated, very recently, that by 2025 they want that to be 200,000 tons of rare earth oxide.
So in 2 years?
Yeah. So we know that they're investing very heavily in downstream production.
No.
And we know that the upstream, the mining, isn't necessarily a limiting factor. It's not limited yet, at any rate. They can keep expanding, at least into the short term, at the rate that they have been.
How much of it, you mentioned Myanmar there, and that was something I really wanted to talk to you about as well, because we saw earlier this year, there were some calls, especially in the tin industry, that Myanmar were going to be restricting their exports to China. How dependent are China on Myanmar and their rare earth mining?
So the whole world is dependent on Myanmar's rare earth mining, just because of that dysprosium and the terbium that comes out of those ionic adsorption clays. So at the moment, it's hard to tell because all of it comes from an area called Kachin. I might be mispronouncing that. And there have been protests in Kachin in specific areas against the local government, specifically against Chinese companies that have been wanting to set up rare earth mines there.
Okay.
Leading local governors to promise that that will not go ahead and that there will be no rare earth mining in those little municipalities.
But that is mainly just for the prosia, not NdPr.
There's also NdPr in those ore bodies. There is. It's just not as NdPr centric.
Okay.
So they will have closer to 4 or 5% dysprosium, whereas regular hard rock mine will have 0.1%.
Yeah.
For example.
What's the like? Obviously, you can't spectate the future, but if there were to be restrictions on Myanmar sending rare earths to China, would that dampen their aspirations of 200,000 tons or more moving forward?
Maybe. Yeah. It's hard to say, because some would point to the lack of growth in Chinese clay mining for heavy rare earths and say that that is a clear sign that they're unable to do so, and that they've been relying on Myanmar very heavily. The fact that they have been relying on Myanmar very heavily, but we don't know if they can grow production in existing ionic clay deposits in China. They are mining it. And we know that there have been some difficulties and some closures of illegal mines within China because they do not meet environmental standards. That's one of the problems in Myanmar, is that the mining conditions are horrible. People are really suffering that are forced to mine there. People that live in the area, it is an objectively bad situation for them. So maybe China can restart or grow ionic adsorption clay mining. Maybe prices just need to be a little bit higher for them to make the same kind of profit.
You mentioned something earlier, which actually at the very beginning, which was about defence and the use of rare earths in defence capabilities. And I think that was something that a few years back that got quite a bit of media attention.
Yeah.
And obviously there is a need in the West to source rare earths, which is why we are starting seeing activity in the USA with building out their processing. Given that, obviously, like you were sort of saying there, that incentive pricing might not necessarily get to where, or especially at the moment, where we need to. Does that matter when it's critical metal like this and it is required for defence and they're surely the governments, such as the USA or Australia or the UK, they'll want to fund this anyway, right?
Yes. So a large part of the funding has been from governments. A great example is Lynas Rare Earths. So that's a Australian mining company. They operate the Mount Weld mine in Australia. They're now going to be cracking and leaching in Australia as well, and processing their material in Malaysia. They've recently received $258 million worth of financial support from the US government to build a processing facility in the US. So that's the government directly putting their money where their mouth is.
Are you expecting to see more of that?
We're expecting to see more processing growth.
Yeah.
Can't say how much the government will support that. This may just be the first step, but
not specifically for Lynas, but just in terms of support for rare earth projects globally.
It's hard to say, because the moves so far have been quite significant. Also in Australia, the Australian government gave I believe it's 1.25 billion Australian dollars in a non-recourse loan to a company to build a processing facility, again in Australia, that can also take in third-party feedstocks. So it's going to be scaled so that it can't only process its own material, but can also actually just buy material elsewhere, which at the moment there is no independent processing capacity in China, outside of China, at scale. So that's again, that's no laughing matter. That's a large amount of money being invested. It's hard to say if that sort of support will continue. This may just be the kick that the market needs. I mean, whenever we speak to developers that are looking to develop a mine anywhere in the world, they do tend to speak about the US as a very attractive downstream opportunity. They already have partners that want to build a processing facility there, or they're planning to do their pilot facility there, or they're planning to build a facility there in the long term as well. So we're certainly expecting to see growth in processing outside of China. Even in Europe, we're expecting to see that. But it's hard to say the extent to which the government will be involved in that, and the extent to which the government needs to be involved in that. Because at a certain point, like you said, if prices are too low, the government just needs to step in because investors, it doesn't always make sense for them on paper.
Agreed. What about the demand side of this? You mentioned a few other things there, and the main things that are getting headways is obviously EVs and wind farms or wind turbines. What's your estimation on how demand could increase within the NdPr space?
So we're expecting demand to grow by about, say, 80% by 2030 for rare earth permanent magnets, and to be more than double by 2040. Okay. So we're expecting rapid growth. Of course, over 2021, 2022, there was surprisingly fast growth in China, which sort of front-loaded some of this demand and has slightly reduced our demand expectations. But nonetheless, it's going to be very rapid. We're expecting e-mobility to be a massive driver of growth, particularly also in Europe, where there's very sort of favorable policy towards EV adoption and moving away from internal combustion engine vehicles. Same in China, same in other areas of Asia, and of course the US as well. Wind turbine is something that is an end use that's a little bit, it's a little bit more uncertain, because there's been this trend towards hybrid turbines that actually only consume about 10% of the rare earth permanent magnet that a regular, say, direct drive PMSG system would. And so what that means is that if that trend were to continue, which it certainly looks to be continuing in China, the demand projection for wind turbine does decrease a little bit. It grows in our analysis, but it doesn't necessarily grow its market share very significantly.
I wouldn't mind actually hearing a bit more about that, because obviously if you can shrink the demand for rare earths to about 10% of it currently is for wind turbines, is there any risk of substitution within EVs itself, do you think?
Yes. I think that largely depends on the price as well.
Yeah.
So that's one thing, if we're talking about price suppression and low prices, that is in a way also beneficial for a healthy pipeline of long-term demand. When prices are higher at a certain point, it makes sense to substitute out the rare earth permanent magnet at a certain point. And we have seen companies do that. We have seen companies moving towards other sort of motors and developing other sort of motors that don't contain rare earths. There's plenty of research in magnets that don't contain rare earths or contain less rare earths, or they contain less heavy rare earths. But it's of course impossible to predict breakthrough technology. Our demand estimates include some sort of thrifting assumptions and slight substitution assumptions. But at the moment, as it stands, these magnets are just incredibly efficient. Okay. So they need to be quite expensive for it to make sense to use something else. If we're looking at it purely from a sort of unit cost perspective.
I wouldn't want just trying to summarize really, because it seems as though we're in it's an interesting market in a way, because obviously there's no shortage of reserves out there by what you're saying.
Yeah. And
there's no shortage of, or there's no lack of capacity for China to ramp up their processing.
Yeah.
So I guess from those looking outwards as an investor looking into this market, it doesn't seem as appealing as some other battery metals in a way, does it? From what you're saying, because there isn't that scarcity there.
Yep.
No, I guess how far into the future do we need to get into a scenario where demand could outstrip supply, or?
Right. So that's a tough one, because we have a decent idea of what China's policy might be out to 2025, particularly given that we know what their processing capacity will be. We've got a fairly good understanding of that. Of course, past 2030, what's their quota going to be? That's very, very hard to predict. We do know, when we take a relatively conservative estimate on Chinese growth, when we already account for brownfield growth in Australia, where they're looking to double mining output from Mount Weld, the existing rare earth mine there. We do know that we need about at least 9 to 13 new mines to come online with an average PRND content and output by 2030 for the market to be balanced. So of course, when you vary assumptions on China, when you vary the size of these mines, it that number will change a little bit. But the fact is we need new mines coming online.
But how much of that, you were talking about a mine in China that has a 200-year reserve life.
Yeah.
I mean, surely if they had a way to ramp up capacity, that could eat into those 9 to 15 new mines.
It absolutely could.
Yeah.
And that's the risk.
Yeah.
And that's why someone looking to invest in the rare earth space needs, I think, a higher risk appetite than other markets.
Yeah.
Of course, the potential gains are fantastic when you look at, say, investors in NP Materials or the outlook for other companies outside of China. The potential gains are really, really great.
Well, just look at the ASX most of this year or most of last year with rare earth companies. It was a fantastic place to be in.
Yeah, exactly. There are just significant risks involved. So in that sense, I guess it purely depends on your risk appetite and on how you choose to view Chinese capability of growth.
Yeah. Interesting. Dan, thank you for your time.
Thank you very much.